Hello, everyone. My name is Engin Isin. I'm a professor of international politics here at University of London Institute in Paris and in London in Queen Mary University of London. We are delighted to have you here for the lecture. I'm going to be walking you through the concept of doing international politics, which is practically the main theme of the both BA in international politics as well as both 3-year programs and 4-year programs. So I will introduce you to the concept, and then we are going to ask you if you have any questions, and I will be joined by my colleagues here in ULIP to take any questions that you may have. So, doing international politics is a concept that we have been using for a while. It refers to two things, both in doing international politics, in the sense that when we look at scenes of international politics, which I will show you in a few minutes, the questions such as, are we only spectators in just simply observing and watching international politics unfold, and to what extent are we actors in the various scenes that we actually experience? What I mean by scenes of international politics, that over the last few years we have had prominent cases of artists, activists, NGOs, and other forms of actors, as well as non state and state actors, international actors entering into the political arena by staging certain political events, as it were. A case in point, for example, Ai Weiwei, who is a Chinese dissident, who is a installation artist and performance artist. He had significant influence on number of issues as an artist in the political arena in international politics. And just recently, he posed as a drawn Syrian infant refugee in a photo that many people found a haunting photo. Here's a shot of that scene. Here, he seems to be making a statement about how enraged he is by being a spectator in a scene that sees thousands of people lose their lives by virtue of seeking refuge, by fleeing war, conflict, and starvation. And yet, it seems that in relatively wealthy nations of Europe, there is little concern to be able to address the problem at the scale that is wanted. And as an enraged protest, he does this. And it's, of course, discussed with great interest in international literature and international discourse, whether this was morally right thing to do, whether he was ethically on the right to be able to do this. But this is an example of an actor um, intervening in international politics and demonstrating that just merely being a spectator is not enough, but he also wants to insert himself as an actor. And this is an example of an individual actor, but also we have collective actors in international politics, in international scene, such as Doctors Without Borders, which on the one hand provides aid, but also enters into political negotiation with states and international organizations to be able to provide the aid that it wants to provide, and critically engages in human rights advocacy. So it does not just merely provide aid, but asks critical questions about the role that particular states and international organizations play in not providing human rights protections to various people. And recently, for example, it refused 1 million free vaccines by a company that Doctors Without Borders felt that was not engaged in ethical practices in terms of being able to do the work that it needs to do. So we see these collective actors actually play significant role in shifting the terms of discourse, terms of debate in international politics. Well, speaking of terms of debate and changing discussion and debate in international politics, we have another example. You will know Edward Snowden, who was a CIA operative who at one point felt that he actually knew number of objectionable practices by various states in mass spying and mass collection of information about private communications and without leaving them private. And he leaked information about that, and he shifted the international discussion about privacy of data, whether, for example, even when we are doing this communication, do we have a right to privacy, whether this communication should be encrypted, whether government organizations, states, and other authorities should have a right to, in fact, to bulk spying on private communications. This is an example of a particular actor who is not necessarily political at one point, but finds himself in a compromising position, and he decides to go with a human rights narrative to international audience to constitute himself as an international actor. And we also think about, we often identify refugees and many migrants in international politics as merely victims of their situations, and most visual material that circulates about refugees constitute them as victims. But then it raises questions about to what extent they are merely victims, but also actors in this drama being played out. They are changing also terms of political discourse about the ways in which we understand refugee crisis, migration crisis, and so on. To what extent should we just merely understand them as victims versus actors in a political drama? This also comes into being, particularly in refugee camps and internment camps, where refugees are held in Australia and Europe. And this becomes an issue where both refugees and migrants and migration activists actually stage protests to ask serious questions about not extending human rights protection that are actually guaranteed under human rights laws to refugees who arrive in various jurisdictions, especially, as I mentioned earlier, fairly wealthy countries. So now in all of this, I use some languages like actors, sites, practices, methods. So I just want to, just having given you scenes of international politics where we see different kinds of events taking place, the question arises, as students of international politics, how do we investigate these events? How do we make sense of them? Obviously, we have to develop certain analytical tools and languages to be able to give sense and meaning to these events, to be able to investigate, to be able to study. But also, we need to be able to find analytical tools where we are not merely as spectators in studying international politics, but we are also participants. We are actors in it. What tools do we have available to be able to get a sense of this? I have already mentioned actors, repeatedly use that term. It's good to think of actors in terms of non-institutional and institutional, as well as state and non-state actors. It's important to be able to provide some classification by which we simplify the ways in which people act in the political scene. So it is, in terms of state actors, for example, institutional ones are national, supranational, such as European Union, intergovernmental organizations, decision makers, lawmakers, newsmakers, policymakers, media agencies, and institutes are typically state related, state regulated, and state sanctioned, as it were, or legitimated institutional actors. But we also have non-institutional actors in the state area. States often support or, in fact, organize and arrange non-institutional actors on behalf of them to undertake state-like activities. Could be trade organizations, labor organizations, aid organizations, can take that form as well. Non-state actors typically take the form of non-governmental organizations, international non-governmental organizations, transnational corporations, cities, universities, charities, donors, philanthropists, and experts are quite active in the international scene, undertaking international politics. And then in terms of non-institutional actors, we see variety of movements, global society activists, campaigners, claimants, demonstrators, lobbyists, organizers, petitioners, witnesses. It's a complex scene, but what this diagram allows us to give some order, give some sense to this complex scene of actors. Now, these actors become actors, continuing with the dramaturgical language that we have and that I really like, drawn from performance studies and theater studies. We have sites or stages in which these actors become actors, effective actors. And these are also much more than the ones that we typically know. If you are merely focused on or get your news from, for example, TV, you will be familiar with the visual images of the parliaments and legislatures and major court tribunals as where international politics takes place. But there are also other places. For example, I mentioned camps. In camps, international politics happens as a site of confrontation. In camps, for example, various actors would converge on each other and confront each other. So these camps or sites in general become points of condensation, points of confrontation of various actors. In fact, you're able to observe actors as actors doing the kinds of things that they are doing to further their interests and and enact themselves as actors. Um, they they actually confront other actors. So you see security authorities, state authorities, migrant activists, international organizations, national organizations, and global civil society organizations, all converging on these spaces for protest, for protection, for security. They condense them. So it's important that we don't study only actors in the abstract, but also in specific sites that they come into being and come into confrontation with one another. And contestation, that is the animating element of international politics. And these could be also places like cyberspace. We all know, for example, how Facebook or Twitter can become a site of contestation in traditional elections in the US or a referendum in the UK, where there is concern whether outside or external forces actually produce the means by which various ideas were circulated through cyberspace, particularly those two platforms, Twitter and Facebook, to see that to what extent an international politics actually interfered with national politics. So cyberspace and what happens in these platforms also bring various actors into contestation with one another. They are no longer merely a social media platforms, but they are also sites of international politics, at least when you study them the way we want to study. And I can give you other examples like high seas and courts and streets, but this gives you a sense where when we talk about site or fields of international politics, they are complex condensation points that bring various actors into contestation with one another. Now, none of these sites actually come into being overnight. What maintains and what makes them durable, these sites of confrontation, are various practices. So, in addition to studying actors and sites, we also study practices through which these sites become repetitive, routine sites that have certain durable existence. And that cannot be done without practices of monitoring, surveillance, protests, patrolling, and you name it. There's so many other activities that on an ongoing basis actually establish these sites as sites of confrontation and contestation. So we then look at under what conditions these practices are able to maintain durable sites and under what conditions some practices actually cannot maintain durable sites, and then they dissipate and occupy London or Occupy New York, for example, or Occupy Madrid can be slogans that depended on practices to identify certain squares as sites of international politics, but they also lack durability for various reasons. Now, obviously, this is a complex scene, and we can say so much. I'm condensing usually a lecture that I give up to 3 hours with the participation of students into really a short period. But one thing that I want to leave with you also methods of and as doing international politics. I mentioned earlier that we need to think about analytically how to investigate doing international politics. And in terms of methods, it's often useful to divide it into three. On the one hand, there is the descriptive element of the ways in which we study international politics. Descriptive in the sense that we want to give an account of, description of something that we observe as being a significant event. But the description is never a description in and of itself and purely. There's always normative elements, normative background that we bring to bear on what we see. For example, in Ai Weiwei's example, you might be actually outraged about the refugee crisis, and then you might be studying refugee crisis as someone who has very strong views about what the responsibilities and rights of states are, what states should be doing for refugees and refugee crisis. This is the normative aspect of it that we can't really separate from merely descriptive. But there's also the performative dimension to studying international politics, and this is exactly what we try to actually address and include in terms of this notion of doing international politics. So when we are studying international politics, describing and normatively engaging, developing critical ideas, in some ways we're also participating in international politics. We become more than spectators, but we all begin to have impact on each other's views and and broader public's views about how we should think about certain events that are taking place in international politics. So studying international politics has this performative dimension in the sense that we always are transformed from mere spectators into actually actors in the international political scene. Then the question becomes, what kind of actors are we as students of international politics? What responsibilities do we have for the observations we make, the knowledge that we produce, and how we disseminate that knowledge? All sorts of ethical and political questions we address. I have gone through a fairly complex ground in a very small space, and I hope that you enjoy this taster. What we're going to do, I'm going to be joined by my colleagues in ULIP, and if you have any questions about either about the lecture or broadly the program that we are establishing, please feel free to share your questions with us. Thanks very much.